As Queensland Baptist leaders, we really care about the safety of our young people. Here are some short videos to help you and your church succeed in creating a safe environment for vulnerable people in your communities.
This training is based on the Queensland Baptist Safe Church Strategy. In Psalm 36 verse 7 it says, "How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings." Our God is so loving, so kind, and as we reflect Him, we want our churches to be a place of safe refuge, a place where everyone flourishes, especially our children.
And Jesus wants vulnerable people to come to Him. We see this throughout the Bible. As a faith community, it is our responsibility to make sure we do not hinder this.
And not only do we want vulnerable people to be safe, but we also want them to feel safe, so that they are truly able to hear and receive the love of Jesus. Being a safe church is the responsibility of the whole church.
Queensland Baptist Safe Church Strategy. The QB Safe Church Strategy is provided by QB Services to assist churches in the movement to comply with government regulations as laid out through the Blue Card system. Churches may decide to include additional measures that aren't included in this training that are important for their context and specific environment that ensure their people stay safe. This training follows these guidelines. However, it is important that those who lead in the ministries and are over 18 read and understand the strategy for themselves.
The Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is the component of this strategy that explains the specific expectations of team members. It really helps us to ensure kids are safe. Your ministry may have additional expectations, but most of these are also government expectations and important for us all to follow. A code of conduct is an agreement that tells us how we act and behave as leaders.
The Code of Conduct General Guidelines. These are some general guidelines that are a part of the Code of Conduct. Be respectful and courteous to others. While this is specifically referring to how we treat kids, we should also model kindness, avoid discriminatory treatment of others. For example, don't treat others differently due to their ethnicity or gender. Use language that builds people up, and certainly avoid swearing. And be aware of what the kids would also consider swearing. As a part of acting respectfully, be on the lookout for the bullying and be aware of how children may perceive team members teasing of each other. Like in-jokes can come across as bullying, regardless of how the recipient may feel. Realize that even in times that you are not in ministry, you are still a team member and represent the church. It is important to always act with integrity.
Protect the privacy of others by ensuring you don't gossip. Always speak positively about everyone. Keep all information confidential unless you need to tell the pastor or ministry leader about a particular concern you may have. During sharing times, kids can share a lot and you can learn a lot about a child's life, and it's a privilege for you to be a part of this. It's important that you don't share this privileged information with anybody else. But tell your ministry coordinator or your pastor if a child tells you something that indicated that they're not safe in any way. You don't need to quiz the child about it or try to fix it, but it is important that you tell your leader. This might be that they have unusual bruises or they mention that they've been harmed in some way at home, at church, or at school. Tell your leader. It is also helpful to say something like, "I have something I need to tell you," when you tell your leader, so they know to pay particular attention. If it isn't appropriate to tell your ministry leader, you can also tell your church pastor or an elder. Most churches have a safe church person, so they are also a good person if you can't tell your ministry leader. But if possible, tell your ministry leader as soon as you can, or even during the program is good.
Your church must comply with your strategy for managing group sizes, ratios, and enrollments. All areas need to have at least one over 18 adult to supervise and be responsible for what happens in that space. Sign-in and out procedures need to be in place at every ministry. Legally, you need to keep records of all the people that are in your ministry space, so all team members must also sign in.
Behaviour management. Remembering that our main goal is relationships and discipleship and not necessarily well-behaved children, here are some guidelines to help you run smooth ministries with positive relationships. Do. Be clear with instructions and ensure the kids have a focus. If kids don't have an activity to be engaged with, they will probably just run around. So be clear with expectations and consequences. It can be helpful to provide choices. Are you going to come and join us with this activity, or will you go and chill in the quiet space? And reinforce good behaviour. Catch them doing the right thing. Rave to their parents when they're doing the right thing. Tell them positive things that you like about them. Be interested in them and ask questions. Ask them what they like to do for a treat. And if possible, incorporate that into your morning. Provide extra support for kids who may need it and be aware of the many different special needs that kids have. These kids can find it very hard to focus for a long time or may need one-on-one help or a place where they can calm down. The noisy, highly lit and busy space of a kids' ministry can make it hard for them to regulate their emotions and behaviour. So be aware that they may not be intentionally misbehaving. Listen respectfully to the needs of children and vulnerable people about what makes them feel safe and act appropriately. Provide a space that is calm for overstimulated children. Okay, some don'ts. Don't be emotional as you give a consequence. For example, being really mad or cross. Don't yell or use unkind words. Don't use big adults church or big church as a punishment. You can text parents or go and get parents. If this is the final consequence, that is fine. You may need to set this up with parents beforehand so that you can work that out together. Make sure that they know that you care for their child and need their support to ensure the child has a positive experience of kids' church.
Electronic communication and social media. All our electronic communication must comply with your church's electronic communication and social media guidelines. We must not engage in any communication digitally that would be in breach of this policy. Generally, we don't engage individually with any primary age children. Each church should have their own social media policy, but hey, we have one on our QB website, so head over there and check it out. General guidelines. We must always be visible to others when with the children and young people in our care. Be in areas where other ministry team members can see you. Don't be alone in a place or a space with any young person. For example, avoid being in a room, storeroom, a kitchen, a pantry, a toilet. In preschool spaces, don't play in a tent. Well, I didn't even know that was a thing, but don't play in a tent or enclosed playground with a child.
Toileting process and nappy changes. If possible, children should go to a toilet that is a child-only toilet and can generally do this in pairs. Where this can't happen, ideally, 2 team members should take a child to the toilet with a leader who makes sure they get there safely. If this isn't possible, 2 children can go with a leader accompanying them. The leader should check that the toilet is clear of other adults and stand outside the toilet to wait for them to walk them back to the program. Just remember, in all situations, stay in full view of others and never be alone with a child. There are very few reasons why a parent can't change their child's nappy or change their clothes if they have soiled themselves. So always communicate to parents or get someone to fetch them to change a nappy. And if for some reason a parent can't be reached, for example, their parent is preaching, then another adult leader can stay with the ministry coordinator to change the nappy. The same procedure happens if a child needs assistance getting dressed, another leader comes and supervises.
Unwell young people and first aid. If children are unwell, they can't attend your ministry. Make sure you communicate to parents that if a child has vomited or is unwell, your rules are just like school or daycare. All ministries should have a first aid kit and someone who has a current first aid certificate. The first aid person is the only one who should administer first aid. In most instances, the parents are in the building, and so it is good practice to let them know as soon as possible if they are injured, including even small bumps to their heads.
Do not touch wee, poo, sick or blood without gloves and without your church's cleaning products. Most churches have a policy around how to clean these things up. Always protect yourself and fetch parents to collect children if there has been an accident.
Outside or other ministry time. Caring for the kids in your ministry by catching up with them outside of the ministry is a great way for caring for them. However, it is the same as within your ministry. You need to be with parents when you do this. You can't be alone. If you organise extra outside of ministry activities for your group, you need to ensure you have several leaders present. For example, you can't invite all the young people to your house for a sleepover and be the only leader. If this is a scenario and there are a group of leaders running an outside of program activity, then all adults in the house must have a blue card. Ensure you always get approval from your ministry coordinator before arranging additional activities.
Generally speaking, you should avoid driving children that are in your ministry. But if extreme circumstances exist, this should occur with 2 staff or 2 volunteers and after gaining permission from the child's parents and a church leader in a direct position of responsibility.
Adult content. All leaders must conduct themselves appropriately with all children and vulnerable people. This includes ensuring they are not exposed to inappropriate material for their age. For example, also be aware that even some Bible stories may be particularly graphic or have adult content. Avoid any adult content with children, including ensuring you are using appropriate language.
Physical contact. When it comes to physical contact with older children, elbow bumps are the new high five. A pat on the shoulder might be appropriate. If you need to console a child, make sure it is welcome and only side hugs are appropriate and in full view of everybody else. But many kids don't like physical contact, so remember that you can only do this when it's initiated by the child and the child is the same gender as you. And this may be obvious, but just to be clear, because you can't touch kids, the following things are included. You can't wrestle, tickle, poke, piggyback, or even have kids sit on your lap. But very young children may need to be held or to be distracted when they're upset. Be aware that distraction with playing with toys is a great strategy. Each ministry should have a particular amount of time that they allow a child to be unsettled before going to get their parent. Communication with parents and carers is important, and this should guide you. Some are fine for their children to take some time to settle into the ministry and can be easily distracted, but others will not want their children upset at all. Generally though, as a ministry, we want our children to have a positive experience at church, as well as having a reasonable expectation of our volunteers. Usually we work with the 5 to 10 minute rule, and if a child hasn't settled by then, we'll just call the parents or text them. Obviously, if a child is very distressed, you would get the parents straight away.
Sometimes we need to touch a child if they are injured, helping them with an ice pack or bandage. Asking permission before you do this, be in the vision of others, let parents know as soon as possible, but remember that we are only to give first aid if we are the first aid appointed person. Informing parents indicates care. Fill in an incident form for injuries so that if necessary, everyone knows what happened.
Pastoral care. Be aware that you are not a qualified counsellor, and if kids have gone through trauma or a particularly difficult time, they will need proper support. When it comes to young children, communicate with parents as you support them. It's great to be prepared to pray for your children, as that is always a way of showing your care and support.
Encourage children to also share with parents, guardians, or other leaders, including chaplains. If kids want you to be the only person they tell about things, this is not an appropriate relationship. Sometimes kids tell us things that are heavy. It doesn't happen very often, but it is important for us to know what to do with that information if they do disclose something. Share issues that are heavy with your ministry leader. If a child shares with you something that is quite heavy that is going on in their lives, make sure that they know that they might need to tell another person if it means to keep them safe. If a child tells you something that indicates that they are in harm or may harm themselves in some way, tell your ministry leader or pastor as soon as possible. Certainly that day, even better if you can tell them during the ministry time, even if a child has asked you not to say anything. Remember that then telling your ministry leader, this is confidential information. If you need to talk about it with someone else, tell your ministry leader or pastor, and they will either talk about it with you or find the appropriate person for you to talk with.
Workplace health and safety. Understand and comply with risk management plans. Every ministry we run with young people should have a risk management plan, and all team members should know what is included. For example, before a ministry happens, all of the potential risks are considered, like what are we going to do about those electrical leads to make them safe? Or how are we going to keep the kids from running off? What are safe boundaries? What are we going to do about the risk of that dam on our property? All of these risks need to be considered, and then a plan must be put in place to minimise the risks to the kids. If you see a risk, inform your ministry leader. For example, if you see a broken toy with sharp edges which could cut a child, show it to the ministry coordinator or pastor before throwing it away or trying to fix it. In a preschool environment, ensure that there are no small parts that could be swallowed or choked on.
Keep yourself out of danger. Don't go climbing ladders without the training required. Don't jump up on roofs to collect balls. If there are barriers in place to prevent access, keep them there.
Know the location of first aid kits, the fire extinguishers, fire blankets, and other emergency equipment. Know the identity of the first aid attendant in your ministry area. Incident and accident forms help the church leadership know what has happened and prevent the accident from happening again. An incident can include anything from a breach of code of conduct to an incident of bullying. It is good to fill in one of these forms so you can be best supported in your ministry.
Photography. Do not take photos of kids during the ministry. Only a ministry-specified photographer can do this for promotional purposes, and the photos can only be kept on a church computer. Parental permission is required before photos are taken of their children, and additional permission is necessary for any photos to be used for promotional use.
Complaints. Complaints and feedback should only be dealt with by the ministry coordinator or pastor. All team members can say positive things to parents. Anything else is generally the responsibility of the team leader or coordinator. If any parent wants to give feedback, the team member can let them know that all feedback goes directly to the ministry leader.
The rest of this training is content created for those over 17 years. Those turning 18 this year will need to have this training. While much of this training is to comply with government regulations, as followers of Jesus, we want to ensure we provide the safest spaces for our children and vulnerable people in order for them to thrive in our communities and in their faith formation.
We would also like to give a trigger warning here. This material can be sensitive for some people and heavy, and sometimes dredge up feelings and issues. If this happens for you, please feel free to leave the space. We would encourage you not to sit in silence about this issue, but to seek someone who cares about you to talk with.
Queensland Baptists recognise the 10 national principles for child-safe organisations. They provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding child-safe cultures within organisations that engage with children, and act as a vehicle to give effect to all Royal Commission recommendations related to child-safe standards.
The Safe Church Strategy. Every church must have a safe church strategy. This covers the protection of all vulnerable people, including children, the elderly, and those with additional needs. All staff and volunteers must agree to comply with the strategy in order to serve in your ministries. This training covers the annual training required by every volunteer.
Blue cards. All staff and volunteers who are over 18 years old must hold a current blue card. They must stand down from duties immediately if they receive a negative notice or are a known disqualified person. Have their blue card or exemption card cancelled or suspended. Have their blue card application withdrawn. Receive a notification in relation to a serious change in criminal history. Immediately advise the church pastor and Blue Card services if there is a change to their police information. It is important to understand that those over 18, only Blue Card holders are the team members in the ministry. Name tags or t-shirts help to easily distinguish team members.
Blue Cards: recruitment, selection, training, and management. QB churches recognise the importance of recruiting staff and team members who have skills and attributes to fulfil the roles involved with working with vulnerable people. To ensure this, all such roles will require an application form as an initial screening tool. An application for working with vulnerable people will only be considered if the following criteria has been met. Churches that the applicant has attended or been involved in or connected with in the past 5 years are contacted to ascertain whether there have been any alleged or actual incidents of harm involving the applicant. The applicant has signed and returned the Code of Conduct. The Safe Church Coordinator has completed an interview to ascertain the suitability of the applicant. In the case of a volunteer, the person has attended the church regularly for a minimum of 6 months, unless exceptional circumstances apply. The applicant's Blue Card has been cited and details recorded. If the applicant has not obtained their Blue Card through the church leaders must also arrange for the completion of a link to organisation. Referee checks have been completed. And the Safe Church Coordinator will, in consultation with staff and volunteers, establish a training plan setting out the type of training that will be provided, the regularity of the training, and the expectations that the church has for attendance and participation.
Drugs and alcohol. Churches are to be committed to maintaining an illegal drug and alcohol-free environment. Staff and volunteers acknowledge that the consumption, sale of, or being under the influence of alcohol or illegal drugs while working with vulnerable people will result in dismissal and possibly a report to the police.
Disclosures of suspicion of harm. It is now a requirement for those working with children to report if they suspect any child is being harmed or is at risk of being harmed. While this is a legal requirement, as loving faith communities, we want to care for all the vulnerable people in our churches. This harm can take place in any space, in the child's home, with friends, or at school. A suspicion of harm is when someone has a reasonable suspicion that a child has suffered, is suffering, or is at an unacceptable risk of suffering significant harm. A child who has been or may be experiencing abuse may show behavioural, emotional, or physical signs of stress and abuse. There may also be other circumstances where there is concern for a child's welfare, but it does not reach the threshold to be considered a disclosure or a suspicion of harm. Your church has a duty of care to follow up any suspicions of harm or potential risk of harm to children in our care. We do this by observing and recording the actions of children who might be at risk and reporting these concerns to the relevant authority.
Defining harm. Harm is defined as any detrimental effect of a significant nature on the child's physical, psychological, or emotional well-being. Harm can be caused by physical, psychological, or emotional abuse or neglect, or sexual abuse or exploitation. The Child Protection Act 1999 requires certain professionals referred to as mandatory reporters to make a report to child safety. If they form a reasonable suspicion that a child has suffered, is suffering, or is in an unacceptable risk of suffering significant harm caused by physical or sexual abuse and may not have a parent able and willing to protect them. While these people have a mandatory responsibility to report, we believe that child protection is everybody's responsibility and every person should report to child safety if that person forms a reasonable suspicion that a child has suffered, is suffering, or is at an acceptable risk of suffering significant harm, and does not have a parent able and willing to protect them from the harm. Any person is lawfully entitled to make a report if they are concerned for a child's welfare, even if they are not required to do so as a mandatory reporter. Anyone making voluntary report is protected with regard to confidentiality and immunity from legal liability.
For us to be able to report suspicions of harm, we need to be able to identify what harm could be. On your screen now is a list of the types of harm that can take place, starting with physical harm.
Psychological or emotional abuse. On your screen is a list of types of harm that can take place with psychological or emotional abuse.
Sexual abuse or exploitation. On your screen is a list of the types of sexual abuse and exploitation. Please be aware that it is now mandated for every adult to report suspicions of sexual harm.
Suspicion of harm. Identifying harm. On your screen is not a complete list of the types of abuse and resulting in harm that may be experienced by young people. However, it is to be used as a predictive tool for potential signs of harm. Each young person's experience is different and depends on a range of factors, including their age, the nature of harm, how long the abuse has been occurring, their relationship to the abuser, and their support networks.
Identifying neglect. On your screen is a list of things you may notice in the situation where a child is being neglected.
Disclosure of harm. A disclosure of harm occurs when someone, including a child, tells you about harm that has happened, is happening, or is likely to happen to a child. Disclosures of harm may start with, "I think I saw." "Somebody told me that." "Just think you should know." "I'm not sure what I want you to do about this, but..." It is important to act quickly and in the best interests of the child after a disclosure of harm is received, irrespective of the alleged source of harm.
Disclosures of harm. What to do. Remain calm and listen attentively, actively and non-judgmentally. Ensure there is a private place to talk in view of others. Encourage the person to talk in their own words and ensure just enough open-ended questions are asked to act protectively. For example, "Can you tell me what happened?" Or "Could you tell me more about that?" Don't ask leading questions, which tend to suggest an answer. Ensure the person is advised that the disclosure cannot remain a secret and it is necessary to tell someone in order to get help. But reassure the person that they have done the right thing by telling you. Do not attempt to investigate or mediate an outcome, and follow this strategy's procedure for reporting a disclosure of harm. The Safe Church Coordinator and church leadership will consider whether there are requirements to report matters to the Queensland Police Service or Child Safety, or consider what support services could be offered to the family if the concern does not meet the relevant threshold to make a report. This determination will involve implementing the recommended 3-step process for assessing a disclosure or suspicion of harm. Guidelines for using electronic communication in ministries involving young people. Guiding principles. Consent. A parent or guardian's consent must be sought and be in place before engaging online or via any form of electronic communication with a young person. Verbal consent would be considered unacceptable as it does not meet the principle of traceability. No online engagement or electronic communication can occur where consent has not been given or where the parent or guardian has indicated that they do not want online communications to take place between their young person and church staff or volunteers. Any online group involving children 12 years or younger must be set up using a parent or guardian's email and login details must not disclose a child's full name. Groups involving teenagers must ensure that parental or guardian consent covers off a young person's email being used as a login. Consent should also encompass the details of all platforms to be used, the purpose of the engagement or activities, and how information will be managed, so accessed or stored. Additionally, consent should identify specific timeframes for when church staff and volunteers are permitted to communicate online with young people. For example, maybe not before 8 a.m. or after 8 p.m.
Traceability. Does the platform have a digital footprint, and can it be accessed if the need arises? So things that might send a photo and the photo disappears later is not traceable. The church should consider what platforms they will use and how they will effectively achieve the principle of traceability and being able to review online activity or engagement. Accountability. What in-person practices in ministry can be replicated in an online environment to ensure accountability remains in place? For example, student leader ratios, 2 leaders present during an online engagement. Transparency. How is church governance and oversight enacted in implementing online ministries? For example, have processes, procedures relating to ministries and activities been updated and endorsed by the church leadership? Additionally, the concept of transparency should be considered in the context of oversight, data protection, and also privacy obligations. For example, considering the privacy requirements of gathering people's data to an online platform. How is this data stored and used by that platform? Who has access to this information? And how long do they have the information for?
Safety. Online platforms are ever-changing, and churches need to consider how to remain up to date with changes to privacy settings and restrictions. The following are recommended considerations for incorporating into online ministries and activities for young people. Live stream. When using live stream, no images of young people should be used if the church doesn't have consent for their image to be online, or if there is a custody issue that could endanger them if they were seen online. If a church is streaming in a way where members of the public can access that stream, chat functions should be disabled where young people are involved. If a church is streaming in a way where members of the public cannot access the stream, so a closed Facebook group, for example, the chat is permitted with young people. Online groups. Links to any online platforms should not be available in the public domain. Instead, they should only be sent to those invited to the group. Private chat functions through these platforms should be disabled. Maintain a minimum of 2 staff or volunteer leaders and a minimum of 2 participants. And consider gender dynamics. For example, don't have a group discussion where all of the group participants are of the opposite gender. Photographs and screenshots should not be permitted.
Social media. Comply with the terms of any social media platform. For example, Facebook and Instagram have a minimum age of 13 years for someone to have a personal account. Where possible, use of social media with young people should be via church ministry accounts rather than personal accounts. Establish systems to enable a minimum 2 staff or volunteer leaders able to see all communications with a young person. This includes direct messages, text, email, social media, video chats and clips. Retain chat history. The church and its staff and volunteers should not use social media platforms for ministry activities which cannot be traceable. Consider privacy settings which prevent personal contacts from seeing or interacting with the young people connected to your ministry. Care must be taken with online communication and consideration given to how an engagement may be perceived directly by those viewing or receiving it. For example, ensuring the text or image is beyond reproach and cannot be misconstrued. Text-based communications. To assist with the principle of accountability, all emails to young people be CC'd to a church email address or an email address of a supervising church staff member. Where possible, text or direct message communication should be restricted to providing general and publicly available information or must have another person added to the conversations. Emails, texts, and direct messages that are sent or received should be kept and stored in an appropriate place for the purposes of traceability.
Additional code of conduct training for over 18s. Team members must not make any sexual or crude innuendos, jokes, sounds, display visuals, words, acts, or gestures towards any individuals. In relation to pornography and sexuality, staff and volunteers acknowledge that they recognise it is inappropriate to access or view pornography. They will not display, discuss, or distribute pornography to other adults or vulnerable people. The sexuality of staff must be under the guidelines and the Lordship of Christ. They'll dress modestly and not sexually suggestive. Clothing will be without slogans contrary to Christian principles. Avoid improper use of their position, particularly a position of authority or as a spiritual mentor.
In relation to physical contact, staff and volunteers acknowledge that they must comply with the church's protocols for injury management. Must not touch any person in a way that is inappropriate to the situation or uncomfortable or confusing for the receiver. Will only console if this is with the permission and welcomed by the vulnerable person. Will only console a vulnerable person of the same gender and with another staff or volunteer within sight.
Reporting breaches of strategy. It's vital that we report any suspected breaches of this code of conduct or this strategy to the Safe Church Coordinator or relevant church leadership immediately. Know where the forms are to report breaches. Take careful written records of any suspected breaches and report to the relevant person. If you are unsure, you can always contact QB Services. Don't stay silent if you know of abuse or a breach of code of conduct.
What was not included in this training? Specific church processes for reporting harm or non-compliance of code of conduct, fire safety process, lockdown process, mental health first aid for kids and youth, creating and using a risk management form, your church's health and safety policies, general training in leading in kids and youth ministry.
If you need assistance in any of these areas, please feel free to contact QB Services and we would love to help you.